Good afternoon. You're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Jes Delos Santos. Let's take a look at how the local bourse closed today, Monday. Okay, the index finally snapping out of its losing ways, starting the trading week right with a 1.2% increase. The bellwether index today at 6,913.87. Lan Soledad of AB Capital Securities is expecting sideways trading to persist as investors await second quarter earnings season. But Darren Pangan of Timson Securities said after that selling streak last week, expect bargain hunters to take stock and pick up heavily battered shares. True enough, if you try to take a look at our leaders and laggards for today, you have Jollibee. Some of the heavily sold stocks last week are now one of our big gainers, at least for today. You have Jollibee for one, gaining close to 3 4/10%, now at 209.80. Ayala Land also gaining 2 6/10%. Same thing with GT Capital, SM Investments, Pure Gold, and JG Summit. In fact, also, you only have 6 members here of the 30-member main index in the red. You have Emperador, the day's worst performer, down 1 9/10%. But also BPI here, even after it secured Philippine Deposits Insurance Corporation approval for its merger with thrift unit BPI Family Savings Bank. BPI today is lower by a 1%, 1.25% to 87 pesos and 30 centavos a share. Now, let's step out of the main index for a bit. This is Merrymart announced that it will purchase at least 67% post-investment stake in Carlos Superdrug. Now, for those of you wondering, Carlos Superdrug has 27 branches and EBITDA and net income positive. That makes it the largest pharmacy chain in Quezon Province. Now, the grocer said it's open for more mergers, especially in the grocery and pharmacy space. Now, Merrymart climbed as much as 4 3/10% after that news, but pared back those gains to 4% at the close, ending the day 4 pesos and 14 a share. Now, still on the all shares, Filinvest just got the green light, this time for its REIT offering. We're talking about 4.89 billion common shares, which will be listed under FILRT. Now, it's going to be valued at 50 centavos a piece, with secondary offering to be offered by Filinvest Land for 1.6 billion common shares. There's also going to be an over-allotment option of 163 million common shares. FLI after that news, still a 1 peso and 16 centavos a share, up 1 75%. Now, to cap things off, let's have a quick check of our local currency here. The peso today weakening for the 9th straight day. BDO Chief Strategist Jonathan Ravela said that a weak peso signals a recovery as imports grow, something, of course, expected in the latter part of the year. Adding to that downtrend is how there's not much remittances coming in during the third quarter. Ravela sees the near-term risk for the peso to be at 50.50 to 51. Looking at how the peso is faring today, you can see it's now at 50.09 to the greenback. Again, 9th straight day of weakness here for the local currency. Here are other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. The government wraps up the data collection of over 37 million Filipinos for the National ID program. This pushes the government closer to its year-end target of 50 to 70 million Filipinos who have completed the first step of the process. At least 16 million Filipinos are also done with the second step of the national ID system process, which is having their biometrics taken. Meanwhile, some 300,000 already received their national ID cards. The National Economic Development Authority, or NEDA, hopes to boost financial inclusion in the country and to make cash aid distribution more efficient through the National ID program. The Philippine Statistics Authority expects to register the majority of the Philippine population by 2022. Now, 13 million vaccine doses have been administered in the country so far, according to the latest record from the Health Department. Over 9 million Filipinos are still on their first dose. The DOH says additional vaccine shipments are expected this month. This includes at least 3 million single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccines, 6 million more Sinovac doses, and 500,000 Pfizer shots. Meanwhile, Interior Undersecretary Epimaco Densing tells One News's Agenda that they are targeting to input the names of 95% of vaccinated individuals in a central database by next month. Densing says they expect to release internationally recognized vaccine certificates by August 9. As the Delta variant sweeps through Asia-Pacific, many economies are forced to reimpose restrictions to curb the surge in cases. But the country so far has managed to control a possible spread of the variant, with cases in fact already plateauing, at least according to the health department. Now, does this give government some room to further ease mobility curbs? Let's get insights from Moody's Analytics Senior Economist for Asia-Pacific, Katrina Ell. And we speak to her straight from Sydney. Good afternoon, Katrina.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now, first, on a more regional perspective here, how is the surge in cases due to the Delta variant affecting growth in Asia-Pacific? And what's the common factor here among these nations experiencing a surge or resurgence in cases?
So what we're really seeing throughout Asia-Pacific, through many economies, Southeast Asia, even in Australia, we are seeing that governments are really having a lot of trouble trying to contain the number of cases. And as a result of that, they're introducing social distancing measures, or like what we're experiencing right now in Sydney, lockdown measures. And that's really problematic for economic recoveries throughout the region, because it means that households are being compelled to stay home, non-essential businesses are closing. And so what that really means is domestic demand is being suppressed. And we're not going to see those economic recoveries really gathering steam or taking hold until we're able to contain localized infections. And this Delta variant is proving particularly difficult to do that, particularly given how contagious this strain appears to be.
Question is, how vulnerable is the Philippines, especially when it comes to the Delta variant?
Well, what we're seeing is that, for Philippines, Southeast Asian neighbours, for example, Indonesia, they have proven very vulnerable, and they're really struggling to contain the Delta variant. And so, it would seem like the Philippines is particularly vulnerable to that strain at the moment. And so it's good news that the Philippines has been able to contain their infections at the moment. But at the same time, I mean, the Philippines is still dealing with daily cases of around 4,000, which is quite significant. And given the fact that social distancing measures in Philippines have eased a little bit, that does increase the vulnerability of the Philippines to then inheriting that Delta strain.
Now, given all that, how will those factors at least color your growth prospects for the country this year?
Okay, so when we started out this year, we expected that the Philippines was going to grow about 5.3%. So GDP growth was going to hit 5.3%. But then we downwardly revised that to 4.9% after the Philippines experienced that massive surge in cases in early April, where daily infections were hitting 10,000. And so what we're seeing is the Philippines is struggling to contain localized infections, just like other economies in the region are as well. And until we see a more significant vaccine rollout that will make economies less vulnerable to infection outbreaks, then that's really going to keep these economies underperforming. And Philippines definitely falls into that category.
Now, of course, you have authorities here at least predicting or at least projecting a maskless Christmas this year. Would you say that's something that we can look forward to, or at least hold off on that ambition at least for the year?
I would say that a maskless Christmas does seem optimistic in the Philippines, but I would also say that a maskless Christmas does seem optimistic for the region as well, because we are seeing that COVID is just a difficult thing to contain. And while, in one breath, it might seem like governments are able to contain infections, in the next breath, we then do see a spike in localized infections. So, what it does seem like prudence is the best path forward. And so I think we're going to be quite some while away before it seems like a good idea to no longer need those precautionary measures like a mask in order to contain the virus.
Now, given all that, well, of course, one concern here is about easing restrictions. I mean, just last week, it has been approved at least for minors 5 years and up, they are already allowed to go out of their homes. But the question is, how should government calculate their move on whether or not to ease restrictions further, especially here in the National Capital Region?
I mean, it's an incredibly difficult balancing act, because on the one hand, you need to contain COVID, but then on the other, side of the scale, you really need to get the economy moving again, and you can't stay in lockdown forever. And so it's just this difficult balance that is really difficult to strike. And I wouldn't say that anyone in the region has really been able to achieve that yet, because and the Delta strain makes it even more difficult to achieve that, just given how contagious it is. And so, one concern that we do have with the easing of restrictions, including in Manila with such densely populated areas, it does then increase the risk that there will be another outbreak, given the easing of social distancing measures. And then that could potentially be the trigger for further lockdown measures and further restrictions being introduced that could then hurt GDP growth even further.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you mentioned earlier your growth forecast for the Philippines at least has been slashed to 4.9%. Can you give us at least a rundown again of what are the key issues here?
So what really drove that downward revision was the fact that we saw that incredibly high spike in cases in early April for the Philippines, so daily infections were running at around 10,000, and then we saw now daily infections have plateaued to 4,000, but that's still quite high, and then that does mean that Philippines is still vulnerable to further spikes in cases that could then trigger additional social distancing measures. So that's why we have the Philippines sitting at this underperforming level of 4.9%.
And at the same time, what do you think on the flip side, however, what do you think are the possible upsides here for the Philippines?
So one of the key, upsides is the increased vaccination supply that appears to be coming online, and we're seeing that, this month, the Johnson & Johnson supply is going to be increased to the Philippines, and that's really good news because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for example, only needs that one dose to then be considered fully vaccinated. So with only 5% of the Philippines population currently vaccinated at the moment, which is very low, this one dose that means a fully vaccination is positive, because it means the Philippines will materially be able to really speed up the campaign to fully vaccinate their population.
Okay, and lastly now, Katrina, when do you see the Philippines at least returning to pre-pandemic growth?
So our expectation is that the Philippines isn't going to return to pre-pandemic growth. And so that's when GDP comes back to its level that we saw in the December quarter of 2019 until the third quarter of 2022. And that actually puts the Philippines as one of the clear laggards in Asia, because, for a lot of economies, they are expected to return to pre-pandemic levels of growth around middle of this year. So that's a significant difference, and the Philippines is really lagging behind a lot of its peers in that area.
All right. Thank you very much for your insights again. Katrina Ell, Senior Economist for Asia-Pacific over at Moody's Analytics. Thank you, Katrina.
Thanks.
And those are the biggest stories this trading day, July 12, 2021. Catch Businessworld live again tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. for the market open and 3:15 p.m. for the market close. I'm Jes Delos Santos. We are One News. Mask on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines.